From the National Congress of American Indians, this is The Sentinel.
Welcome to episode 2 of The Sentinel, bringing you all things NCAI from our 1944 inception to today. I am Kenrick Escalante, Director of Digital Media at the National Congress of American Indians and citizen of the Quechan Nation.
And I'm Yana Allen, NCAI's Director of Communications. I'm a citizen of the Quapaw Nation and a descendant of the Cherokee Nation and Yuchi peoples.
In today's episode, join us as we explore 3 recent tribal cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court and the profound impact on Indian country. Then we'll dive into a critical issue of native water rights alongside a recap of the 2023 NCAI Mid-Year Convention in Marketplace.
That's right. And now that it's July and the Supreme Court has wrapped up their work, we wanted to take a few minutes and get an update on the cases that impact Indian country the most. To do that, we'd like to welcome NCAI's Director of Policy and Legal, Ryan Seelau, to tell us more. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
To get started, Ryan, can you give us a quick overview of how many federal Indian law cases were heard this term and how they turned out?
Yes, of course. The Supreme Court heard 3 federal Indian law cases this term. Brackeen v. Holland, which dealt with the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Lac de Flambeau v. Coughlin case, which focused on whether a tribal nation could use the sovereign immunity doctrine to avoid being sued under the federal bankruptcy code. And they also heard Navajo Nation versus the Department of the Interior, which is a lawsuit about the Navajo Nation's treaty rights, and more specifically their water rights. Out of those 3 cases, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the tribal interests in the Brackeen case, but against tribal nations in the other 2. Both the Lac de Flambeau case and the Navajo Nation case were losses for tribal nations.
Thank you for that overview. I wanted to follow up on what you said and to get a little bit more detail on these cases. Let's start with the victory. Can you tell us a little bit more about the issue at stake in the Brackeen case?
Yes, of course. The Brackeen case was, in many respects, one of the most important Indian law cases the Supreme Court has heard in years. The case was a series of challenges against the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, a piece of legislation passed in 1978 because of the disproportionately high rate of forced removal of Native children that resulted in essentially Native American culture loss as a whole. This case was brought by individuals seeking to overturn or at the very least weaken ICWA. There were claims that Congress didn't have the constitutional authority to pass ICWA in 1978. There were claims that Congress illegally commandeered state governments to enact ICWA in violation of the 10th Amendment. And there were claims that the entire basis of ICWA was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause.
At the start of your remarks, you mentioned that the case was an important victory. What exactly did the Supreme Court say in response to the arguments against ICWA?
In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court rejected all of the challenges to the law. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that Congress has broad power to legislate for the benefit of tribal nations. The Supreme Court also said that nothing ICWA requires of the states violates the 10th Amendment. And then the Supreme Court turned to the equal protection argument and dismissed those arguments by noting that the people bringing the case lacked standing to challenge the statute on those grounds. Standing is a legal doctrine designed to only allow lawsuits to move forward by people who are actually harmed by the law being challenged, and the Supreme Court noted that no one in this case had demonstrated any harm from the operation of ICWA. Because the Supreme Court's decision on the equal protections grounds was dismissed due to lack of standing, it is possible in the future that someone could try to challenge the statute again on equal protection grounds, but that notwithstanding, the Brackeen decision is a huge victory for Indian country and for all of federal Indian law. And I encourage everyone to read the Supreme Court's decision because it is filled with strong language in favor of protecting tribal nation sovereignty and tribal nation culture.
Thank you for expanding on that decision, Ryan. It was a very emotional day here at NCAI and across Indian country when that decision came out. And of course, we are very grateful that it was decided the way that it was. But despite that major win, you also talked about 2 cases where tribal nations did not come out victorious. One of those was the Lac de Flambeau v. Coughlin case, which was actually decided on the same day as Brackeen. You previously mentioned that the Lac de Flambeau dealt with tribal sovereign immunity. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and what was at stake in that case?
Yes, I'd be happy to. As you mentioned, the case dealt with a legal doctrine known as sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is a legal principle that sovereigns, which in the United States includes the federal government, state governments, and tribal governments, cannot be sued against their will. The idea behind the doctrine is actually centuries old and is traced back to this British idea that the king can do no wrong, meaning that the king or the sovereign is above the law unless they agree to going to court. Similarly, governments can only be brought into court if they consent to doing so. Now, within the U.S., the federal government has the power to force states and tribal governments to go to court in certain circumstances, so long as Congress passes legislation saying so. In this case, an individual was using a provision of the federal bankruptcy code as the basis for a legal claim against the Lac du Flambeau tribe, and the tribe invoked sovereign immunity, which means the tribe said, "We don't consent to being sued under the bankruptcy code." The question in this case then was, does the bankruptcy code clearly state that tribal nations cannot use sovereign immunity when people sue under the provisions of the code? In essence, the entire case turned around one sentence, and the Supreme Court had to interpret that sentence. Ultimately, in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled against the tribe and said that the bankruptcy code does not allow tribal nations to use sovereign immunity to get out of lawsuits invoking the bankruptcy code.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. Could you do the same for the third case? What was at stake in the Navajo Nation case that the Supreme Court ruled on in this term?
Yes, the Navajo Nation versus Department of the Interior case dealt with a number of complex legal issues revolving around treaty rights and what is called the trust relationship. As many people are probably aware, the United States signed a large number of treaties with tribal nations, and these treaties all created different rights based on the language that's in those treaties. In addition to the rights specifically mentioned in treaties, federal law states that the United States has a general trust responsibility to all tribal nations to protect certain interests for tribal nations and to provide certain things for them, for example, healthcare. This case specifically dealt with the water rights of the Navajo Nation. Everyone in this case agrees that the Navajo Nation has some sort of water rights within their reservation. But for decades, those water rights have never been quantified, and for decades, the United States hasn't done anything to specifically protect those water rights for the Navajo people. So this lawsuit was an attempt by the Navajo Nation to say that the United States government, we have water rights and you are our trustee. You need to do something to ensure that our water rights are protected, and at the very least, you need to take steps to figure out exactly what water rights we have.
That's really interesting. So the Navajo Nation wasn't asking for a specific quantity of water rights, but just that the United States figures out what their water rights are?
Yes, exactly. The treaty, which is about 150 years old, exists, but no one has ever sorted out exactly what rights the Navajo Nation has to water, and that's what they were asking. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision said that the Navajo Nation cannot force the United States to take any affirmative steps to secure water for the Navajo Nation. Instead, the court said that in general, the U.S. is not a typical trustee, and its obligations to act are minimal unless statutes or treaties specifically say otherwise. In response to the Supreme Court's majority opinion, Justice Gorsuch wrote a spirited dissent laying out the history of tribal nations, the history of the Navajo Nation Treaty specifically, and concluded that since no one disputes the Navajo Nation has reserved water rights, it logically follows that they should be able to file a lawsuit against the U.S. for failing to provide an accurate accounting of those same rights. Ultimately and unfortunately, this case will likely make it harder for tribal nations to file lawsuits against the United States, claiming that the U.S. has breached its trust responsibility. If there is a silver lining, though, it is that this decision was only a 5-4 decision, and there may be opportunities to limit its reach or even change it in the future. But for now, it is the law.
Ryan, thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go if they want to learn more?
For those individuals interested in learning more, you can go to the Native American Rights Fund website. That's narf.org. And then click on the Tribal Supreme Court Project button, where you will find opinions as well as briefs in all the cases that we talked about here today. In addition, the Protect ICWA campaign, which was a coalition of a number of Native organizations, put on a panel that had tribal leaders from the Brackeen case, as well as legal experts on the Brackeen case, and you can re-watch that panel anytime you want at the NCAI YouTube page.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we continue, we'd like to pause and shine a light on the dedicated staff at NCAI and recognize the important work they do. Here now to introduce this next segment is NCAI Digital Media and Special Projects Associate Violet Johnson. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode's Staff Spotlight.
For this episode's Staff Spotlight, we'd like to welcome Rochelle to the podcast. Rochelle is our 2023 Wilma Mankiller Fellow here at NCAI. The Wilma Mankiller Fellowship Program provides an exceptional opportunity for emerging young professionals from across Indian country to work side by side with national leaders in tribal policy. Welcome, Rochelle.
Aletu, Seuf Chafuya Rochelle, Umasea, Dulak Ametele. My name is Rochelle, and I'm a citizen of the United Houma Nation of Southern Louisiana. During my time here as a Wilma Mankiller Fellow, I'll be working on NCAI's policy team to address legislative issues of importance to Indian country. Unlike many of the generations before me who were barred from attending white schools in Terrebonne Parish, thanks to my family's many sacrifices, I was afforded the gift of pursuing an education. I hold a bachelor's in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from Emory University and a master's in international law and human rights from the United Nations mandated University for Peace in Costa Rica. I'm passionate about elevating the issues that affect Indian country to the international level. I believe that we gain collective strength when we act in solidarity with our Indigenous relatives across the globe. Ultimately, the transnational corporations whose practices continually harm our communities know no borders. So it makes most sense to me that our community organizing efforts remain unconfined by imaginary lines and colonial borders. At the end of the day, our collective liberation requires that we embrace our interconnectedness and challenge systems of domination together. My human rights background has led me to work with asylum seekers from Indigenous tribes across the Americas. Because of my work with these communities, I'm fluent in Spanish and have a basic working knowledge of Portuguese. Additionally, I grew up in a bilingual household around my dad, who speaks French, the first language of most of our Houma tribal elders. Exposure to these languages has opened my eyes to other worldviews and concepts that simply aren't available to monolingual English speakers. This realization led me to wonder how learning my own tribe's native language might impact the way I view the world around me and my place in it. My curiosity led me to join the Houma Language Project, a volunteer-led effort to reconstruct Houma, my tribe's pre-contact language. Right now, apart from reconstructing the language, the team is also working to create an oral history collection, an online archival database, to centralize and digitize historical, legal, cultural, and linguistic resources for future generations to access. Climate change is quickly eroding our coastlines and has dispersed our native community across various states. With the breakdown of our Bayou Indian communities and a loss of connection to place, we hope this online digital initiative will allow members of the Houma diaspora a way to connect back to their native identity. Ultimately, our biggest hope is that future generations, regardless of where they are forced to migrate, know who they are and feel proud of where they come from.
I think that really resonates with a lot of us. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rochelle. NCAI is needed now more than ever. Nearly 80 years ago, when NCAI was founded, the organization brought together tribal leaders and citizens to join as one voice to protect tribal sovereignty. Today, we honor that legacy by unifying the interests of American Indian and Alaska Native nations and citizens as a national Congress. Join us and raise your voice for all of Indian country. For more information on how to join NCAI, visit ncai.org/membership.
Now that we've learned more about policy from Ryan earlier in this episode, we hope you have a better understanding of how NCAI advocacy has the potential to make a huge impact on key issues. Now we're going to examine an issue that affects every corner of Indian country, water rights, and how tribal leaders and the NCAI policy team work in collaboration to secure them. In this segment, we will look specifically into the decades-long fight by tribal nations along the Colorado River to secure access to clean water.
We're taking a look back at NCAI's historical involvement in the fight for tribal nations' access to the natural resources of the Colorado River. A recent $1 billion multi-state agreement and other water sovereignty wins across Indian country prompted us to ask the question, how does NCAI's history of advocacy fit into the bigger picture of water rights in this region? Now, I'd like to welcome NCAI archival specialist Suzanne Gould to join me in sharing the story of water rights through the years. Thank you for joining us, Suzanne.
Thank you, Yana. Through consulting archival records at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, we found that NCAI began addressing water rights much earlier than we originally suspected. In fact, shortly after its 1944 inception, NCAI leaders and advocates brought water rights to the national agenda. In 1948, just 4 years after its foundation, we see the question of water rights emerge in the archival records. a resolution at the 5th annual conference held in Denver, Colorado, boldly called for a complete reorganization of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, from the reservation level to Washington, D.C.
A larger plan adopted at the end of that conference put in place a comprehensive review of treaties, executive orders, laws, and regulations affecting tribal nations. The goal of this review was to ensure adequate provisions for the protection of tribal water rights. This generic call to action is the first time we see water rights specifically addressed in any NCAI policy initiatives.
Yes, that's right. And the next year, NCAI leaders sprang into action. The then called Phoenix Area Region held the first ever regional conference of NCAI in 1949 with a focus on water rights. Designed as a gathering of all southwestern tribal nations from Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, the meeting brought together 125 delegates from 19 tribal nations, along with the governor of Arizona, to address Indian water rights of the Colorado River.
In 1949, NCAI voiced its opposition to several bills in Congress in support of irrigation projects that would divert water from the Colorado River and endanger water access on reservations in Arizona. Representatives from the Gila River, Pima Maricopa, and Wallapai tribal nations attended the 6th annual NCAI conference held in Rapid City, South Dakota, to express their opposition to the proposed projects. Warning that these projects would cut off a vital source of their water supply, NCAI leaders exclaimed, "We are objecting to this high-handed method of handling our resources."
As the years progressed, stronger and more sharply focused statements on the Colorado River crisis rose to a crescendo. In 1953, a resolution requesting protection of Indian water rights was adopted at the 10th annual conference in Phoenix, Arizona. Beginning as a traditional policy resolution, it grew in scope, transforming into a much larger and more comprehensive statement on the organization's emerging approach to water rights. The end result was NCAI leaders boldly calling out the federal government for abandoning their responsibility to protect tribal water rights in the region.
Stating that the lives of 65,000 Indians in the region were at stake, this strongly worded resolution was originally conceived as a plea for help, but transformed into a demand that President Eisenhower and his government must fulfill their obligations to tribal nations in 3 specific ways. One being that they must agree to and assert the prior and superior rights of Indians to use the water on the Colorado River. 2, that they consult with tribal nations on all matters and provide files, data, and research relating to the river. And 3, that they prevent anyone from intervening with Indians' access to the water. This resolution asserted that the government must pledge to protect and assist tribal nations in defense of their water rights.
Throughout the remainder of the decade, NCAI leaders expanded upon this powerful statement and issued a dire warning: keep up the pace, or political forces aligned with economic interests would eliminate Indian water rights altogether. These initial years of Indian water rights defense set the stage for the decades to come and served as the blueprint for NCAI's water rights advocacy that later spread across the country.
To get a sense of where tribal nations stand with respect to water rights today, one only needs to turn to recent news surrounding the Colorado River. In a significant multi-state agreement announced in May 2023, the federal government pledged a staggering $1.2 billion in compensation to municipalities, water districts, and tribal nations in Arizona, California, and Nevada.
The compensation comes in exchange for reduced water consumption, a step forward in addressing a complex, decades-long issue. However, it's important to acknowledge that this development represents only a fraction of the overall resolution. Many tribal nations in the Western and Pacific regions are still awaiting settlement agreements with the federal government, while the water scarcity in these areas has reached crisis levels.
At the recent 2023 NCAI Mid-Year Convention and Marketplace, NCAI hosted a roundtable discussion featuring federal officials, tribal leaders, and legal experts on existing and future challenges related to water rights, and how tribal nations are already taking action to safeguard the water that sustains their people and their communities. Please enjoy this clip from the mid-year session titled Water Scarcity and Conservation.
My name is Michael Chavarria. I serve as governor for Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico and the Southwest region, vice president. So again, hello and welcome to this panel discussion on water scarcity and conservation in Indian country. We have a great lineup of folks with us this morning to share their expertise with all of us, and hope that you can take away new knowledge and advice that can be put to use in your own respective tribal communities with respect to water, conservation, and infrastructure. As an example, Santa Clara Pueblo is involved in multiple ecosystem restoration projects that have local, regional, and even international implications with our connection to the Rio Grande, which traverses 3 states and 2 countries. We are currently developing an integrated resource management plan that will capture the innovative water conservation strategies we're evaluating on Pueblo lands. This includes the development of nature-based water retention through floodplain connectivity, wetland propagation, and off-channel pond development. These efforts are intended to increase both surface and subsurface water storage, while limiting evaporation and increasing cultural habitat, recreation, and economic development opportunities. By facilitating a sponge effect in our watershed, our goal is to develop higher quality and more resilient water resources to sustain us during more frequent and prolonged climate variability. We also hope that these strategies, if quantified and proven viable, can be used as a model for water conservation and other watersheds, both in our tribal and non-tribal communities. So with that, we do have a panel this morning. And I appreciate the panel, so I'm going to ask your panel to please introduce yourself, and we'll get started with our session. I'm going to start with first Mr. Jamie Pinkham. Please introduce yourself, and then we'll go down the line.
Tatsmewi Inam Latiwa. Jamie Pinkham, Nez Perce Tribe, and I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works in D.C.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing us to be here today. My name is Bobby Page. I'm from the Colorado River Indian Tribes, and I'm a councilman on the council.
Good morning. My name is Sarah LaFleur. I am a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and a policy analyst in the Secretary's Indian Water Rights Office at the Department of the Interior.
Doug?
Doug Krogos, Machiapi, Standing Rock, Sioux Tribe, Hunkpapa, Lakota, Sac and Fox, Winnebago, and Meskwaki Nation with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance chair.
So we have some questions this morning here. So the first question is, for those who are tribal leaders, please briefly describe your tribe's fight for water security and how it is impacting your tribal citizens. So I start off with Bobby. You can go first, and then I'll turn over to Doug.
All the tribes' water rights vary, and they all different in different ways, but we all seem to have the same issues and the same problems when we're fighting for those rights. But water security is not just having a recognized water right that can be put to use the next day, but it also means having the infrastructure to place, to be able to use to further our ability to address the needs of our members. At CRIT, we are farmers, and the success of our farming operations is critical to the overall well-being of our tribe. While we are fortunate to have one of the most senior water rights in the lower Colorado River Basin, and for our water right to be recognized by the Supreme Court in Arizona versus California, our irrigation system is the oldest BIA project in the United States and is in need of extensive repair. Like all BIA projects, our irrigation project has been critically underfunded, and system inefficiencies at our project deprive our members from being more fully able to use our water to the extent of our rights, which harms CRIT both economically and culturally, as well as other tribes.
Doug?
Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance is comprised of several different tribes from the Great Plains region. We have issues with water availability, water conservation, water infrastructure, and just recently, pipelines that are going across our lands that are not being consultated with tribes locally and nationally.
Well, thank you, Doug. So these are all the sorts of battles that we see within all of our respective regions. They're long fought and hard-won battles. But it takes each and every one of us to come together to really focus on who we really are, the uses of this precious resource, and the scarcity of that water. So I know for many of the tribal nations who might be fighting, again with their own regions, what sort of insight or advice do you have, Doug, that you may be experiencing or have accomplished there with the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance?
Policy change and early consultation. Consultation, collaboration needs to happen prior to any sort of policy changes, any sort of action with federal action, federal projects, anything like that. Early consultation, prior consultation. What we see in Indian country, at least in our region, is that, you know, to be honest with you, the states or even the government doesn't come to the tribe until after the process is started. Tribal consultation, the form of consultation is early. You come to the tribes before anything is to happen, and you ask. You compile the information, the traditional knowledge, you know, the TEKs, I mean, everything, and you put that on the table. You come to the table first before the companies come to the table, before you have these huge projects that are, you know, climate friendly, if you will, coming through our lands, coming through our treaty territories. It's unfortunate that some of our federal partners, even, you know, even though they're relatives of ours, you know, they have to follow their script. And sometimes that script isn't tribally, it's not indigenized. And so what we want to see is the culture change.
So Jamie, as we heard about climate change, all the other potential fundings, are there additional fundings that you may have through the Corps of Engineers to assist the Pueblos, tribes, and nations with this innovative infrastructure solutions they may want to implement on their lands?
Innovation isn't just how we build an infrastructure, but innovation is how we think and make decisions. And when Mr. Connor came in, one of the things we set out as one of his priorities is how do we modernize civil works? And that meant taking a look at our processes to see how we can fine-tune them, better accommodate the needs of the tribes and share decision-making with the tribes. The principles and requirements and guidelines is one thing that we see as innovation. The other one, and particular to this issue, is, and Mike may have shared this with you when he addressed NCAI in the past, is Mike issued a drought memo to the Corps of Engineers. And the Corps plays a pretty significant role in drought. I mean, can we do more? Can we do it better? Yes, and we've got to keep asking ourselves, what can we do more and better? One of the things that Mike asked the Corps to do is to just summarize everything they're doing around drought. Where are our authorities? What is WRDA authorized to do? But also then to identify, well, what can we do better? What are some of the roadblocks and solutions to those roadblocks, whether it's the policy changes that we need from Congress, resources, or some internal processes that we can do. So we're looking at innovative ways in how we think and implement programs beyond just innovation around the infrastructure.
All these policies and procedures are very important to impact each and every one of us. So that's why we come to NCAI, so that we can go ahead and figure out strategies and solutions to many of these challenges that we face today. If we don't do it for ourselves, no one else is going to do it for us. So we got to, again, give thanks to the Creator, give thanks for our lands, the areas that we reside in, which is very critical, but also the day-to-day activities that we still continue to use for traditional, cultural, religious activities. So with that, let's go ahead and give a round of applause to our panel this morning. Thank you.
We recognize that the issue discussed in this segment is one that is complex and yet to be resolved. And while this look back at NCAI history is far from comprehensive, We hope it sparks interest in Indian water policy for our listeners. To learn more, visit the Sentinel blog at ncai.org/Sentinel.
Be a part of the historic journey as we celebrate 80 years of advocating for tribal sovereignty at the 2023 National Congress of American Indians Annual Convention and Marketplace in the vibrant city of New Orleans. Join us alongside hundreds of tribal leaders as we gather to shape the future of Indian country. Register now for the 80th Annual NCAI Convention, November 12th through 17th, 2023. Secure your spot by visiting ncai.org/events and register online today. Throughout the 2023 Mid-Year Convention and Marketplace held at the Mystic Lake Center in Prior Lake, Minnesota, we spoke to a few attendees who contributed to the success of the event. First, we spoke with Laura Ann Chesson, Principal Chief of the United Houma Nation of Louisiana and NCAI's Southeast Regional Alternate Vice President, about her experience at Mid-Year.
My name is Ryan Seelau. I'm the Principal Chief of the United Houma Nation in Louisiana, and I came to NCAI because I try to do my best to be here at every meeting because I think it's important, not only the networking, but also what NCAI stands for, is to be able to take other tribes' information and be able to work in DC. NCAI is very important, especially like this morning to hear all about the wind turbine and, not knowing our tribe is going to be affected with that. Our shrimpers, our crab fishermen, our oyster fishermen, I think that's going to be a real task. And in climate change, the meeting this morning when they were talking about climate change, and the only thing I could think of when they was on stage is that my tribe, where I live at, we lose a football field of marsh every 100 minutes. We have the fastest erosion in the world. And so just listen to that, and I'm a fishing woman, and I fish, I shrimp, I'm out there, and I see the land loss. I see where my grandfather lived at is no longer land, it's all water. Where we used to play ball at is all water. So even in my lifetime, I've seen a huge change in our climate. And so it's when I was just listening to that and thinking, where are the kids? They won't even have that opportunity to even enjoy. And there's somebody over here, and we were talking about just recently Feeding America. They came to my area and to the bayous, and I fed them. And we was out in the porch over the water, and something was very disturbing that I seen, and they actually got to witness, as alligator adapting to salt water, and a dolphin right next to it, which is very unusual to see an alligator in pure salt water. And so that's very scary to me that they are adapting. And so the climate change is so real, and we see it every day where we live at.
Next, we spoke with 2023 Youth Commission Co-President Caleb Dash on the culturally relevant mid-year youth agenda.
Skuktash Banyichuga Caleb Dash, Ayanam Jud and Akimelcha Halechitam Pipash Juvat. Hello everyone, my name is Caleb Dash. I come from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community in Mesa, Arizona. I am the current co-president of the NCAI Youth Commission. And I'd say mid-year is going pretty great so far. We'd have some great sessions that we've been tuning into, joining different task force, just listening in, being a representative of the youth, just among tribal leaders and hearing the different ideas that are coming across is pretty great. And with the youth sessions that we're having, we're actually getting quite a bit of members, like different youth showing up. So if you have any youth around, please bring them to our youth sessions. They're amazing. But I'd say one of my highlights would probably be Deb Holland speaking. Auntie Holland, yeah, she was awesome during the luncheon. And President Sharp, I love her speeches. I always love President Sharp. You're amazing. But mid-year's going great. We just started today's morning off with the Movement is Medicine. We went on a walk this morning, and so we were just cheering on different tribal leaders and ambassadors there, and so that was really fun.
Cool. Well, I'm curious if there's anything that you're going to take with you from mid-year to maybe bring back home to your tribal community, or any sort of implementation of the things you've been talking about at the conference.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm really passionate about is finances and financial literacy in Indian country. And so I'm actually here going to be teaching a financial literacy course to youth. And so that's one of the things that I plan on taking with me to my community as well. In September, I already worked it out with my tribe's youth council. We're having an event on our reservation with other youth from different communities. And so there's going to be different cultural teachings, different activities for exercise, the whole movement is medicine. And one of those courses that I'm going to be doing there as well is teaching financial literacy. And so that's a huge issue that I'm passionate about and excited to see on my own reservation as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I'd just like to say thank you to all the NCAI staff. Thank you to all our executive leaders. This has been a great conference, and I'm excited for the next ones to come along. And, NCAI is always going to be here, 7 generations forward, 7 generations back. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for participating in NCAI and for all those that help make NCAI.
All right. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, we spoke with Marcus Anthony Gwen, also known as MC1, on his experience as our convention MC and how working with Native youth has shaped his career as an artist.
The NCAI goes back with me back to the 90s as a student. I would come as we were trying to build the Youth Commission. So NCAI has always had a special place in my heart. I came through Unity, United National Indian Tribal Youth, and we would try to get young people's voices allowed at the congressional level. And so by having NCAI was the first step of having that platform for that voice for youth. And back in the day, youth had even testified before Congress. So having our own indigenous organization dedicated to policymaking at that level was crucial. One cool takeaway, though, is that it's full circle. I remember us trying with all our might to get 5 minutes at the main stage, if possible. 5 minutes of attention from the grown-ups back then were leading NCAI. I was like, can we, the youth were like, can we please get on the agenda? Can we please be heard? We would come to the conference for like a week and do like these little youth trainings and youth tracks, and if we were lucky, we would get to, one of us would get to come maybe address the body of constituents. So fast forward, here we sit, and it's like, I got to watch a youth panel today discuss some things with Google and talk and present themselves. Also, the Youth Commission at a different point. So all through the agenda, I've seen youth be part of it. And not only are they now not trying to just get on stage, they're now effectively challenging status quo and policy. They're not just looking at the stage as the goal, they're looking at change in the community as the goal, and working with NCAI and NCAI making that available to them. Me getting to see that from my perch was cool. I got to take that away and be like, man, it's like you don't always get to see the sprouting, but for me to get to see the harvest come up like that was cool. I got to go, wow, I got to see that from back before it existed.
Yeah.
To the power of the young voice today. It's incredible.
I'm curious to know a little bit about your creative process and what you've been doing here specifically at mid-year and how that plays into the rest of the work that you do as an MC and a creative.
I appreciate that. So I like to leverage my work in the entertainment field to speak to the lives of youth. So I'm a youth facilitator, trainer, and that's my main livelihood, or my main function, if you will, but my livelihood is in the entertainment field, so I DJ, I MC at various different events. I work for Nike and 7 ambassadorship, just try to make sure we keep that cause out there. So official DJ for Nike and 7, also the official DJ for Oklahoma City Thunder in the NBA. I work with Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas all around the world, and that's cool, but getting into a room with young people and seeing the light bulb flicker and seeing their eyebrows crunch together and them contemplating the thought of hope and a changed life and in an increased community and their role in that, that is what time it is. That's long term. That's what